Welcome to Moments in History channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most pivotal conflicts in modern history, the American War of Independence. This wasn't just a war, it was the birth of a nation and a revolution in thinking that would ripple across the entire globe. From 1775 to 1783, a group of 13 colonies dared to challenge the mightiest empire on earth. So, how did they pull it off? Let's find out. To really get what drove this war, we have to rewind a bit. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies had been developing for over a century. They had their own unique economies, cultures, and a growing sense of identity, separate from Britain. But after the costly 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, Britain was deep in debt. To pay it off, Parliament decided the colonies should shoulder some of the financial burden. This led to a series of acts that colonists saw as a direct attack on their freedoms. Think about it: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. These weren't just taxes, they were imposed by a government thousands of miles away, in which the colonists had no elected officials. This gave rise to the legendary rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." This wasn't just about money. It was a fundamental disagreement about rights and power. Who had the right to govern the colonies? The British King and Parliament, or the colonists themselves? Tensions kept climbing. The Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd of colonists, became powerful propaganda for the Patriots. Then in 1773 came the Boston Tea Party. This wasn't a polite gathering, it was a bold act of defiance. Colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and dumped an entire shipment of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act. Britain's response was swift and harsh. They passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, which shut down Boston Harbor and placed Massachusetts under direct military rule. Instead of crushing the rebellion, these acts united the colonies in opposition. They saw it as proof that Britain intended to strip them of all their liberties. The fuse was lit. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet, but they coordinated a boycott of British goods and sent a list of grievances to King George III. But by the spring of 1775, the situation was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. That spark came on April 19, 1775. British troops marched from Boston to Concord, Massachusetts, with orders to seize a cache of colonial weapons. They were met by colonial militiamen, the Minutemen, on Lexington Green. Someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows for sure who. And it became the shot heard round the world. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open warfare. The rebellion had officially begun. The Second Continental Congress convened shortly after, and this time, they took a monumental step. They established the Continental Army, and in a move that would change history, appointed a Virginia planter named George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington wasn't the most experienced military genius, but he had incredible leadership qualities, resilience, integrity, and a commanding presence that inspired loyalty. He was exactly the leader the fledgling army needed. Let's be clear, the odds were stacked impossibly high against the Americans. They were facing the British Empire, a global superpower with a professional, well-trained army and the world's most dominant navy. The Continental Army, by contrast, was a ragtag force of farmers, merchants, and artisans. They were poorly supplied, often unpaid, and enlisted for short terms. Throughout the war, Washington's biggest challenge wasn't just fighting the British, but simply keeping his army together through starvation, disease, and freezing winters, like the infamous one at Valley Forge. The first major battle at Bunker Hill, though technically a British victory, showed that the Americans were not going to be easily defeated. They inflicted heavy casualties on the British, proving their resolve. Yet, despite this bravery, the early years of the war were tough for the Patriots. The British captured New York City in 1776, forcing Washington into a long retreat. It was a dark time, and it seemed like the revolution might be crushed before it truly began. But then came a stroke of tactical brilliance. On Christmas night in 1776, Washington led his freezing, demoralized troops across the icy Delaware River for a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The victory was a huge morale boost. It was followed by another win at Princeton just days later. These small victories were crucial. They reignited hope and showed that the Continental Army could, in fact, win. The real turning point of the war came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. The British had a grand plan to split the colonies in two by seizing control of the Hudson River. But the plan went horribly wrong. American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and the brilliant field commander Benedict Arnold, surrounded and forced the surrender of an entire British army under General John Burgoyne. Saratoga was more than just a military victory. It was a diplomatic bombshell. It convinced France, Britain's old rival, that the Americans actually had a chance to win. Eager to weaken Britain, France officially recognized the United States and formed a military alliance. This was a game changer. The French provided money, weapons, soldiers, and most importantly, their powerful navy, which could finally challenge British control of the seas. Spain and the Netherlands later joined the fight against Britain as well, turning a colonial rebellion into a global war. With French support, the war effort gained new life. But the fighting was far from over. The conflict shifted south, where the British hoped to rally support from loyalists, colonists who remained loyal to the crown. They had some initial success, capturing Savannah and Charleston. The war in the South was brutal and often resembled a civil war, with patriots and loyalists fighting vicious guerrilla campaigns against each other. But American commanders like Nathaniel Greene adapted. Instead of facing the British in large-scale battles they couldn't win, Greene engaged in a brilliant war of attrition. He wore down the main British force under General Cornwallis, leading them on a long, exhausting chase through the Carolinas. Though Greene lost many of the smaller battles, he won the strategic campaign, forcing Cornwallis to retreat to the coast of Virginia to resupply and await the Royal Navy. And this set the stage for the final act. In 1781, Cornwallis fortified his army at a port town called Yorktown, Virginia, believing the British Navy would protect him. It was a fatal miscalculation. A French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, blockaded Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any chance of British rescue or escape by sea. Simultaneously, a combined American and French army, led by Washington and the French General Rochambeau, marched south and laid siege to Yorktown by land. Trapped and bombarded relentlessly, Cornwallis had no choice. On October 19, 1781, he surrendered his entire army of over 8,000 men. When the British Prime Minister, Lord North, heard the news, he reportedly cried out, "Oh God, it is all over!" And he was right. Yorktown effectively ended the major fighting of the Revolutionary War. The will of the British Parliament and public to continue the expensive conflict was broken. Peace negotiations began in Paris, and 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In it, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. It also granted the new nation vast territory, stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. The war was officially over. The United States of America was now a sovereign nation. The American Revolution was more than just a war for independence. It was a revolution of ideas. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, that all men are created equal and have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were radical. They challenged the old world order of monarchy and aristocracy. The war sparked a global conversation about liberty, citizenship, and representative government. It inspired future independence movements in Latin America and the French Revolution. And it set a precedent for people to overthrow oppressive rule and establish governments based on the consent of the governed. The creation of the United States was the start of a new experiment in republicanism, a journey that continues to this day. The American War of Independence didn't just create a new country, it helped forge the modern world. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to Moments in History channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments which historical topic you'd like to see next. See you in the next video.